The rains on Veth Aron came sideways. That was the first thing Cale Danner had learned about the planet, not from a briefing document or a transit authority pamphlet, but from standing on the arrivals platform at Veth Aron Station with his kit bag over one shoulder and watching the rain blow in at a 40-degree angle off the Highland Shelf, horizontal and deliberate as a slap. The covered platform did nothing. The rain found every gap, curved under every overhang, and soaked everything it wanted to soak. After 10 minutes, Cale had been damp from the collar down. That had been 14 months ago. He understood the rain now. He dressed for it, layered midweight over a wicking base, sealed the seams on his field jacket, and wore nothing on the outside he wasn't willing to soak. He'd learned the angle it took off the Highland Shelf in morning versus afternoon, the way it softened to mist near the marshes, and hardened to needle rain near the ridge. He'd learned which parts of Veth Aron Station's lower quarter flooded first, and which drainage channels the maintenance crew perpetually ignored. He'd learned where the best shelter was when a squall came in without warning on the access road between the station and the Colonial Survey Depot. He had learned Veth Aron the way he learned everything, methodically, without announcing it, by showing up and paying attention. What he hadn't accounted for was learning it alongside her. Her name was Scythe Orville Kaentharis. He hadn't known that for the first 3 weeks. She was simply the woman he kept crossing paths with on the survey access road, a non-human, clearly Kaenthi from the pale silver lilac cast of her skin and the elongated taper of her ears, though her build was lean, and her movements had the deliberate economy of someone used to navigating difficult ground. She carried a cartographic satchel and wore a gray survey coat with the hood pulled up, and she walked as if she'd already mapped the road and was simply executing the map. He noticed the satchel before he noticed anything else. It was a working satchel, worn at the strap junction, one exterior pocket reinforced with a strip of heavier material, the main body structured to hold flat documents without folding them. A tool, not an accessory. He'd been using that category of distinction to read people for years. You could tell a great deal about someone by whether their equipment was primarily functional or primarily displayed. Hers was functional to the point of having no decorative element at all, which placed her squarely in the category of people who were primarily interested in doing the work. They'd passed each other twice before she'd said anything. Both times he'd nodded the brief, neutral acknowledgement that didn't demand reciprocation, and both times she'd looked at him with that direct amber gaze for exactly as long as the pass took and then looked away again. No nod returned. Not unfriendly, simply complete. She didn't owe a stranger a nod. He filed this and didn't make anything of it. The third time, it was raining hard. Cale was making his way back from the depot, arms full of relay components he'd been waiting 3 weeks for the supply chain to deliver. He had them wrapped in a weather sheet, but the sheet was inadequate and he knew it, and he was moving fast and not paying enough attention to the section of road that flooded from below rather than above. He went in up to his knee. The components were fine. He'd had the reflex to raise the bundle, but the footing on the far side of the puddle was unstable, and he came up with one boot full of brown water and his balance compromised, and the next step landed on a loose gravel scatter, and he went down hard on his free hand, wrist taking the weight, components staying clear of the ground by sheer stubbornness. She was beside him before he'd registered that she'd crossed the distance. "The relay components," she said, and it wasn't a question. She took the bundle from his raised arm with a precise grip, no ceremony, just the clear read that he needed both hands for a moment. She held the bundle the way you held something you understood was fragile, steady, slightly elevated, no rotation. Cale got his feet back under him. His wrist ached but was fine. He straightened and found her watching him with eyes the color of pale amber, which he hadn't expected given the silver lilac of her skin. He'd expected something cooler, gray or gold, but these were warm and very direct. "Thank you," he said. She transferred the bundle back. Their hands overlapped for a moment. Her fingers were long. her grip stronger than he'd expected, and then she released it cleanly and stepped back. "The section floods from the substrate," she said. "There's a sinkhole cluster 4 meters south of where you stepped. The standing water maps it from above, but the real instability is below the gravel. You should walk the east shoulder past this stretch." Cale looked at where he'd walked, then at the section she described, then back at her. "You surveyed this road." "I survey most things I intend to walk repeatedly." She said it without edge or performance. It was simply the explanation. He adjusted the bundle. "Cale Danner, Relay Systems Coordinator, Colonial Depot." A beat. She seemed to be making a small decision about something. "Scythe," she said. "Survey cartographer, Kaenthi Secondary Branch." She said it in the way people gave partial names, not the formal full form, not yet. He noted it without noting it. "East shoulder past the sinkhole cluster," he said. "Appreciated." She nodded once, clean and certain, and continued up the road. The Kaenthi were not a people who explained themselves to newcomers. Cale had gleaned this through observation. Since the colonial briefing materials on the planet's indigenous population were 3 years out of date, and had been written by someone who'd spent most of their time in the station proper rather than on the access road, or in the survey-adjacent quarters of Veth Aron's lower quarter. What the materials said about Kaenthi's social structure was technically accurate but practically useless, like being told the rain came sideways, and not being told how or why or what to do about it. What Cale had worked out on his own, the Kaenthi operated through a system of extended family lines with formal senior branches and secondary branches were not a diminishment. They were specialists, often the technical or cartographic arms of a family. The family name came first in formal address, but in working context the given name was enough, and a name given freely on a road in the rain was a form of acknowledgement. They did not shake hands. They did not make prolonged eye contact in initial meetings as a sign of interest. That was a later stage signal, and reading it too early was a common colonial mistake. He noted all of this and adjusted accordingly. The 4th time he saw her on the road, he walked the east shoulder past the sinkhole cluster. She was going the other direction and she saw him do it. Something in her expression, small, precise, shifted in a way he didn't have a frame for yet. By the 6th encounter, he knew she was surveying the secondary ridge that ran east of the station, mapping drainage patterns and substrate composition for a pending agricultural expansion proposal. By the 8th he knew the Kaenthi survey system used a notation method 3 centuries older than anything the colonial administration recognized, and she was required to file parallel documents in both systems, which was twice the work and half the acknowledgement. He found this out because she mentioned it once, matter-of-factly, while they were both sheltering under the depot's secondary overhang during a squall that had come in off the western ridge faster than either of them had anticipated. It was the kind of squall that punished overconfidence about timing. Cale had miscalculated the onset by 12 minutes, which was annoying but instructive. She had miscalculated by 2 minutes, which was closer to supernatural, and she didn't seem bothered by the 2-minute gap at all. Simply stepped under the overhang with the composed air of someone who had always planned to be exactly here. She'd mentioned the parallel documentation because the squall had kept them there long enough to run out of silence, and because he'd asked a question about the notation she'd been completing when the rain hit. He'd asked it because the notation was genuinely interesting. The system used a spatial encoding that embedded substrate data as a structural element of the map itself, rather than a separate layer, which was more information-dense than anything the colonial survey system produced, and would have been extremely useful for his relay network planning. She explained it without trimming the explanation. He listened without performing interest he didn't feel. He had the actual interest. It came through. The parallel documentation requirement means I'm producing the Kaenthi notation in full, and then translating it into colonial format, which loses approximately 30% of the substrate encoding, she said. The colonial format doesn't have the data architecture to retain it. That's a significant administrative overhead, he said. Yes, she said. And the colonial office doesn't credit the Kaenthi notation as primary. They credit it as supplementary, another factual delivery. Cale thought about this. He had a reasonable relationship with the colonial office's field coordinator, not friendship, but the kind of professional goodwill built from competence on both sides. He said, "Is the notation system documented anywhere the colonial office would recognize?" She looked at him, that amber-warm direct gaze. "Yes," she said, "I documented it, they have it. They categorized it as contextual reference material. I could raise it as a data standardization issue. Neutral language, no politics. There's a quarterly operations review coming in 6 weeks." A longer look, he didn't push it, the squall was tapering off. "Why would you do that?" she asked. Cale thought about it honestly. Because parallel documentation requirements for the same underlying data is inefficient, and the colonial depot has to receive and act on your surveys. If the primary notation isn't recognized as primary, there's a translation layer introducing error. He paused. And the 30% substrate data loss means my relay network assessments are working from incomplete information. That's a practical problem for me, not just for you. She was quiet for a moment. The rain was easing to a fine mist. "That's a practical argument," she said. "It is. You could also make a justice argument." "I could," he said. "The practical one will actually work." Something in her expression shifted again, the same small, precise movement as when she'd watched him walk the east shoulder. He still didn't have a complete frame for it, but he was beginning to build one. It was the expression she made when something aligned with a model she'd been developing. He was beginning to think he was in the model. Her full name, when he finally learned it properly, came from her supervisor at the Kaenthi Survey Bureau, a compact older woman named Vasith who seemed to regard Cale with polite, calibrated suspicion until the operations review, after which she regarded him with polite, calibrated neutrality, which felt like progress. Scythe Orville Keen Tharis. Keen was the family name. Tharis was the formal lineage suffix. He looked it up and found that Tharis wasn't a secondary branch designation, or rather it was, but the Keen family's secondary branch was the senior cartographic line, which meant Scythe was one of the primary technical authorities in the Kaenthi survey system at Veth Aron. She hadn't told him this. It wasn't relevant to walking the access road. He filed it. He also learned, through the same methodical accumulation of unremarkable context, that she was the third daughter of the Keen family's senior branch, and that the Keen family's senior branch was the noble line of the Aron Kaenthi, not a ceremonial title, but an active governance structure. The senior family made decisions about territorial use, colonial access agreements, and the protocols by which survey data was shared or withheld. Which meant that Scythe Orville Keen Tharis, who walked the access road in a gray survey coat with her hood pulled up and her cartographic satchel over one shoulder, was a princess. She had not mentioned this. He did not mention that he now knew it. The methodical thing, the honest thing, was to treat her as he had been treating her, because that was how they had built whatever this was, and changing it now would be dishonest. She walked the road. He walked the road. They shared overhangs during squalls and compared drainage notes, and he'd learned the way she paused before delivering information she thought might land awkwardly, a small stillness that preceded precision. He thought about her considerably more than the relay systems warranted. He didn't name that, he just noted it. The first time she invited him to the Survey Bureau for a working meal, he brought a thermos of the Highland tea he'd started sourcing from the market stall near the depot entrance, because it was the only hot thing in the lower quarter that didn't taste like the inside of a transit can. He'd found the stall on his 5th week on the planet, when the standard depot canteen options had begun to feel like a logistical problem requiring a solution. The Vasil stall was 3 rows into the lower market, wedged between a tool reseller and a textile repair operation, identifiable by the smell before anything else, something highland and green and slightly smoky that cut through the market's general atmosphere of recycled air and transit residue. He'd bought a cup and the stall operator, a compact, weathered Kaenthi man somewhere in his 70s, who moved with the deliberate efficiency of someone who'd been doing this particular job for decades, had said, before handing it over, "You want to know where it's from?" Cale had said yes, because he did, and because refusing the question would have been rude. 20 minutes later, he'd learned about 6 generations of cultivation on the Highland Shelf, a soil amendment shift in the 3rd generation that had changed the flavor profile toward its current character. The reason the 4th generation family had built the stall here rather than in the upper market: lower overhead, steadier clientele, proximity to the Survey Bureau, which was their primary institutional customer. And the fact that most colonial newcomers bought the tea once out of curiosity and didn't come back because they didn't know what they were tasting. He'd come back the next week, and the week after that. Old Vasil had nodded at him the 3rd time as if an arrangement had been confirmed. She looked at the thermos, then at him. "That's from the Vasil stall," she said. "It is. That's a Kaenthi cultivar. The Vasil family has grown it on the Highland Shelf for 6 generations." "I know," he said. He spent about 20 minutes telling me the cultivation history the first time, which I think was a test, and I passed it by not interrupting. The small, precise expression, stronger this time, almost warm. "Old Vasil considers that a courtesy gesture," she said, letting him finish the history. "He clearly knew I was going to come back regularly if I bought it the first time. I wanted to be a worthwhile regular." She accepted the thermos. She poured 2 cups with the care she applied to everything. She poured tea the way she wrote notation, with an attention to the variable that made people who didn't know her assume she was slow, and then realize she was thorough. They went over the drainage mapping for the eastern ridgeline, which was genuinely interesting. She'd found 3 substrate anomalies that the colonial survey had entirely missed, and her notation system mapped them with a precision that the colonial parallels flattened into averages. Cale had 3 questions about her methodology. She answered all of them directly, no performance, and then asked him 2 questions about the relay system's sensitivity to ground moisture variables, because the drainage pattern she was mapping would interact with the relay network's eastern nodes. He hadn't thought of that, he said so. "Your network was planned before the full survey," she said. "The substrate data wasn't available." "It's available now." "It is." He pulled up the relay network schematic on his field tablet. She leaned slightly across the table and looked at it, close enough that he was aware of the silver lilac of her skin and the faint structural pattern across her left temple that the Kaenthi call their trace marks, like the substrate notation in her maps, information encoded in structure rather than added on top. She studied the schematic with the same quality of attention she gave everything and said, "Nodes 7 and 11 are directly above 2 of the anomalies. If the substrate behaves the way the notation model predicts, you'll see intermittent ground coupling failures and heavy rain within the next 2 years. Could become critical in 3. He looked at her, then at the schematic, then back at her. "I need to file a network assessment." "Yes," she said. "Will you share the substrate data formally? I'll need to cite the source." "You can cite it as Kaenthi primary survey notation, Veth Aron Eastern Ridgeline, survey Tharis 7 through Tharis 14. "That's your notation?" "Yes." "And now it'll be in a colonial network assessment filed by the relay coordinator." She was quiet for a moment. "That's a practical argument," she said, and he realized she was echoing him, and something about the precision of it. The way she had held the phrase for weeks and brought it back now made his chest feel oddly full. "It is," he said. They finished the tea. He came back the following Tuesday with a second thermos. She had the notation maps already laid out. Neither of them discussed this as an arrangement. It simply became one. There was no single moment. That was what he noted later, when he was being honest with himself in the way he was honest with infrastructure assessments, not looking for the clean explanation, but for the actual pattern of how things had developed. There was the fourth working meal, at which she'd started referencing their previous conversations as a matter of course, building on them the way you built on solid survey data, because you'd verified it and it was reliable. He'd said something about the third terrace junction relay nodes coupling variants, and she'd said, without looking up from the notation map, "That's the same substrate layer as the sinkhole cluster section of the access road." And he'd realized she'd been cross-referencing his relay data against her survey data for weeks, quietly, without announcing it, building a model of how the two systems interacted. He felt the particular recognition of one methodical person encountering another. There was the seventh working meal, a Tuesday, light rain on the overhang, at which she'd asked him about Kethris Station, where he'd grown up. Not his work history on Kethris, his childhood, what the station was like. He described it, a transit hub primarily, with the particular impermanence of places where people arrived and left more than they stayed. He'd stayed until his early 20s and then left without much deliberation, because leaving felt like the honest direction. She'd listened the way she listened to survey data, total, non-reactive, building a model. Then she'd said, "Veth Aron is the opposite of that. People who come here either leave in the first 3 months or stay indefinitely." He'd said, "I noticed." She'd said, "Yes, you did." And then she'd returned to the notation, and he'd returned to his field tablet, and neither of them had continued the thread, because they'd both understood where it went. There was the day she'd waited at the depot entrance without explanation, and he'd come out to find her there, and she'd said, with the small stillness that preceded things that mattered to her, "The squall is moving in from the northwest shelf. It will reach the access road in approximately 30 minutes. If you're walking to the bureau now, we should move." The "we" had landed somewhere precise in his chest, and he hadn't moved it. There was the evening she'd shown him the third terrace view of Veth Aron from the Survey Bureau's upper access, where you could see the whole highland shelf in the last light, the rain systems moving off the ridge in gray curtains, and she'd stood beside him with her satchel still over her shoulder like she hadn't fully decided to stay, and he'd said, "This is where you check the morning forecasts," and she'd said, "Yes," and they'd stood there for a while without needing to account for the standing. There was the Tuesday, the 10th, when the Vassil tea had run out midway through the session because they'd poured thirds without noticing, which meant the session had gone longer than either of them had planned, which neither of them commented on directly but which he noted as data. They were both the kind of people who stopped when the work was done, and the work had not been done. None of it was a moment, all of it was a pattern. He'd been mapping it. What he hadn't mapped, because he hadn't known it was a variable, was her mother. The Keene family's senior branch made periodic visits to the Survey Bureau. This was normal. The survey data fed the governance decisions, and the senior branch reviewing data in person rather than remotely was considered correct form. Cale had been at the Bureau twice during such visits and had been present in the corridor, had exchanged brief nods with the older Kaenthi officials, who moved through the space with the particular authority of people who didn't need to perform it. He had not met the matriarch. He knew who she was. Orville Keene, no Tharis suffix, because she held the senior branch designation outright and the suffix was understood. The senior authority of the Aron Kaenthi, Scythe's mother. He'd seen her from a distance twice. A tall woman with the same silver lilac skin as Scythe but darker, more settled. The silver of her hair worn in a formal braid that Cale had learned was a governance context indicator. He'd noted her and not approached, because there was no reason for the relay system's coordinator to approach the Kaenthi senior authority, and he wasn't the kind of person who introduced himself to people for the sake of proximity to status. He understood in the abstract that Scythe's mother existed. He did not think, in any concrete sense, that Scythe's mother was paying attention to him. He was wrong. He found out on a Tuesday, which was the day he and Scythe had established, without formally establishing it, as their regular bureau meeting day. He arrived with the Vasil thermos. He went up the interior stairs to the working room Scythe used for joint sessions. He opened the door. Scythe was at the survey table, as expected. Standing across from her, with the particular stillness of someone who had been having a conversation that had hit a difficult point, was the matriarch. Both of them looked at him. The matriarch's gaze was amber like Scythe's, but cooler, older, with the weight of a great many assessments behind it. She looked at him the way someone looked at a piece of survey data that had appeared in a category it hadn't been expected to occupy. "Mr. Danner," she said. He'd been in enough unexpected situations, in relay networks, in transit depots, in colonial logistical crises, to have learned that stillness was more useful than reaction. "Matriarch Keen," he said. A pause. She had not expected him to know the form of address. He saw it register. "My daughter tells me you've been assisting with the Eastern Ridgeline Survey." I cited her notation in a network assessment. The substrate data was relevant to relay infrastructure planning. He kept it to facts. The Colonial Office has formally recognized Survey Tharis 7 through Tharis 14 as primary source documentation. It's been entered into the network record. Another pause. The matriarch's gaze moved to Scythe and then back. "That's not what she told me," Scythe said from the survey table, very precisely. "I told you he raised the notation standardization issue at the quarterly operations review. I also told you about the network assessment." "Both things are true." "What you did not tell me," the matriarch said, with the measured delivery of someone who'd had this conversation partially before, and was now resuming it with new information present, "is the nature of your regular contact with Mr. Danner." A silence. Cale stood in the doorway with the thermos and did not fill the silence, because filling it was not his call. "We work together," Scythe said. "Our survey data and his relay network interact. We meet regularly to align the data." "Every Tuesday," the matriarch said, "for 11 weeks. "Yes." "With Highland tea from the Vasil stall." Scythe was quiet for a beat. "Yes." The matriarch looked at Cale again. It was a long, careful look. He let it land without deflecting. "Mr. Danner," she said, "would you excuse us for a moment?" "Of course," he said, and stepped back into the corridor and pulled the door closed quietly. He stood in the corridor with the thermos and listened to the rain on the external wall and did not try to deduce the content of the conversation, because that would be unproductive. He waited. He was good at waiting. He treated it the way he treated infrastructure assessments. Give the system time to resolve. Don't force a reading when the data is still moving. The door opened 11 minutes later. Scythe stood in the doorway. Something in her expression was different, not distressed, but held like a tension being maintained. "She's leaving," she said. "She'll come back tomorrow." "All right," he said. "Come in." He came in. The matriarch had gone, presumably through the secondary access. Scythe poured the tea herself, which was new. Usually she let him pour, having established early on that he poured it at the right temperature. This time she needed something to do with her hands. He let her have it. "She wants to assess you formally," Scythe said, her back still partly to him. "What does a formal assessment involve?" "Questions, observation. She may ask to accompany us on an access road survey." She set the cups down and turned to face him. "She's not being unreasonable. This is how the senior branch assesses someone who has become significant to a Kaenthi of the family line. The word significant, delivered with her precise directness, landed where it was intended to land. "I'm aware of what the regular meetings imply," he said. "I'm not aware of it." She looked at him steadily. "No, I didn't think you were." "Will you tell me what to expect from the assessment?" She seemed to make a decision. She sat. He sat across from her. She said, "She'll try to determine whether you are, in her framing, suitable, which means stable, capable, honest, and not pursuing proximity to the keen line for access or status." "And how does she determine that?" "She watches how you behave when you don't know you're being watched. She already has 2 observations from visits where you were present in the corridor." He thought about those visits. He'd been there for legitimate reasons both times, had nodded, had moved on. He hadn't tried to catch anyone's attention. "And the questions?" "She'll ask about your work, your intentions, your family of origin, how long you plan to stay on Veth Aron." "Those are reasonable questions." "Yes," Scythe said. "My mother is not an unreasonable person. She is very thorough." He poured his tea. He considered what to say and said the honest thing. "I'd like to answer them, whatever comes of it." Scythe looked at her cup, then at him. "She may not approve," she said. "Formally, she may find reasons that have more to do with preference than with any legitimate concern." He thought about that. "Then I'd rather know that than not know it." She was quiet for a moment. Then very precisely, "So would I." He didn't sleep particularly well in the 2 days between the corridor moment and the formal assessment beginning. Not from anxiety. He'd identified that it wasn't anxiety, but from the same quality of attention he gave to significant infrastructure changes. The mind not quite releasing from the material even when the material wasn't directly in front of it. He reviewed his own position the way he reviewed network assessments, looking for gaps. He found the same gaps the matriarch would likely find. He was a colonial worker on a fixed-term contract. He had no deep family roots on Veth Aron, and he was a human in a Kaenthi family context that had no precedent for this particular configuration. These were real gaps. He didn't try to rationalize them away. He filed the permanent station classification application on the morning of the 2nd day, because the filing had been pending for several weeks, and delaying it further would have been dishonest about where his intentions actually sat. The formal assessment took 4 days. The matriarch accompanied them on the access road survey the first morning, which was the most unusual 3 hours Kael had spent on Veth Aron. She walked behind them, not intrusively, but positioned so she could observe both the terrain and the interaction simultaneously. He was aware of this the entire time. Scythe walked beside him as she always walked beside him, slightly to the left, cartographic satchel on her right shoulder, setting her own pace, which was slightly faster than most people's and which he'd matched weeks ago without commenting on it. The matriarch's pace matched theirs exactly, which told him she was used to field surveys, not just governance rooms. The 3 questions the matriarch asked during the walk were: what he observed about the eastern ridgeline substrate, he answered from memory, referencing the notation data and the relay node implications. What he would do if his permanent classification application failed. He said he would refile with additional supporting documentation and expected it to clear within 12 months regardless. And whether he'd ever worked on a planet with an active indigenous governance structure before. He said yes, twice, at previous postings, and described briefly the accommodation processes he'd been part of building. She listened to each answer completely before asking the next one. She did not comment. She returned the 2nd day with questions about his family background, parents, siblings, whether he had other obligations or connections that would affect his indefinite residency on Veth Aron. He answered all of them honestly. His family was on Kethra Station, his parents retired, 1 younger brother in medical logistics, no particular pull that would take him back. You find Veth Aaron sufficient? She asked. He thought about it. I find it interesting, he said. I like learning places. This one has taken longer to learn than most, and I'm not finished yet. She looked at him for a long moment. He didn't know what she made of it, but she wrote something in her own notation, brief, 2 characters, and he didn't ask. The third day she reviewed his colony service record, which he'd offered to share. He had a solid record, no infractions, 3 commendations for problem solving under logistical constraint, 1 notation from a previous station for raising an infrastructure concern that had prevented a significant systems failure. She read it with the same total attention. She said once, "This commendation, you flagged the concern 6 weeks before the systems review." Yes, before anyone else identified it. I'd been tracking a variance in the data for 3 weeks by then. When it crossed a threshold, I filed the report. Why 3 weeks of tracking before filing? Because 1 data point is noise. 3 weeks of consistent movement is a pattern. I wanted to be certain before I flagged it. She made another notation, 2 characters. On the 4th day, she asked him directly, "What do you want, Mr. Danner, regarding my daughter?" He thought about honesty and chose it completely. To know her better, to continue what we're already doing, which I believe is worthwhile on its own terms, and is also something I think about a great deal more than relay systems justify. A long silence. The matriarch was in the Survey Bureau's formal meeting room, which was a different space from the working room, higher ceilings. The formal Kaenthi notation maps framed on the walls rather than spread loose on the table. She had chosen this room deliberately. He noted the choice. You're aware of her standing in the keen line? Yes. And you're not pursuing that standing? I'm pursuing Scythe, he said. The standing is attached to her. I'm not interested in it separately. Another long silence. The matriarch's amber eyes were very still. I see, she said. He didn't hear the result directly. Scythe told him the following Tuesday that her mother was considering the assessment. She said it with a small stillness, which meant it was something that mattered. He waited. He was good at waiting. 2 weeks later, the matriarch made an unscheduled visit to the Survey Bureau. Kale was there. It was a Tuesday. The matriarch came into the working room, and her expression was the controlled expression of someone who had arrived at a conclusion they had wanted to arrive at differently. She said without preamble, "I find you adequate for the purpose." Scythe said from the survey table, "That's not what I asked you to assess, and we both know it." The matriarch's expression shifted. "Scythe, I asked you to determine whether he was trustworthy, honest, and genuinely interested in me rather than in the family line. Those were the relevant questions. Whether he is adequate for some other purpose you've assigned him to is not a frame I gave you." The matriarch straightened slightly. "The family line is relevant. I'm the one who determines what's relevant to my own choices within it." Scythe had set down her notation stylus. She was facing her mother with the direct, precise quality she brought to everything important. "You've met him. You've observed him for 4 days. You've read his record. What did you find?" A silence. "He's honest," the matriarch said carefully. "Yes." He answered every question directly. He didn't perform. "No, he doesn't. He is not interested in the family standing." "I know." The matriarch paused, and something in her expression resolved. "He is clearly very interested in you." "Yes," Scythe said. "I know that too." The matriarch looked at Kale, who was standing by the window with the thermos and had been doing his best impression of furniture. Her assessment landed on him and then moved back to her daughter. "I have concerns about long-term colonial residency stability," she said, "about whether the colonial administration will renew his contract. He's already filed for permanent station classification. The application is pending." The matriarch blinked. She had not known that. Kale noted that she had not known that because Scythe had known it, and Scythe had not told her, and Scythe knew the shape of what she wanted. That changes. It changes some things, Scythe said. It doesn't change the core question which you've already answered. You said he's honest. You said he doesn't perform. You said he's clearly interested in me. She paused. Those are the things I needed to know from you because you see things I don't see yet and I trust your observation. But the decision is mine. The matriarch was very still. Scythe, I'm telling you now before anything formal is stated so there's no ambiguity later. Scythe's voice was steady and precise and very clear. Leave him alone. I'm going to marry him. The room was absolutely still. Kale stood by the window. He was aware that this moment was the reason the whole story had been building. The accumulated weight of 14 months of access roads and drainage surveys and Highland tea and Tuesday meetings, and a formal assessment that had taken 4 days, and his own filing for permanent station classification that he'd done 6 weeks ago, because the data on his own intentions had been clear to him for longer than he'd formally named it. All of that had been the substrate. This was the surface reading. The matriarch looked at him. He met her gaze. He did not perform. He waited. You filed for permanent classification, she said. 6 weeks ago, he said. Before the formal assessment. Yes. Why? He thought about it honestly. Because the assessment's outcome wasn't the variable that was going to change the filing. The filing was based on my own data, which was already resolved. Another long silence. The matriarch looked at her daughter, then at Kale, then at her daughter again. You could have told me about the filing, she said. Yes, Scythe said. I decided you needed to reach your conclusions without that information. Otherwise, you'd have been assessing the filing, not him. The matriarch made a sound, not quite a laugh, not quite exasperation. Something in between. She looked at her daughter for a long time with an expression that had too many layers for Kale to read, though one of them looked, under the careful governance surface, like pride. You're going to be very difficult, the matriarch said. I know where I learned it, Scythe said. The matriarch left an hour later. She didn't give an answer, not formally. She said she needed to consult the senior branch, which was true and which she was required to do, and she said she would communicate her formal position within the month, and she left with the particular composed authority of someone who was keeping more than one thing controlled at once. Scythe watched her go, and then turned back to the survey table with a small exhale. Kale poured the tea. He brought her cup to the table and set it beside the notation maps and sat across from her. She picked up her cup. She looked at it rather than at him. You're not going to ask, she said. About which part? About the part where I told my mother I was going to marry you before anyone formally asked anyone anything. He thought about this. You said it to establish the frame clearly before any formal process began, so there wasn't ambiguity later about what you wanted, regardless of how the assessment concluded. She looked up, the amber-warm directness full and unguarded. Yes, she said. That was good judgment, he said, from a survey standpoint. Something in her expression broke slightly, the control at the edges, a small softening. From a survey standpoint. You had data. You mapped the data. You stated the conclusion clearly before external variables could complicate the conclusion. It's correct methodology. She looked at him for a long moment. Then very precisely, are you going to ask? He thought about what he was going to ask and thought about how he was going to ask it, and concluded that he would ask it the way she'd stated her conclusion. Clearly, without waste, with all the data present. Scythe Orville Keen Tharis, he said. I filed for permanent station classification 6 weeks ago, not because I knew this was where we were going, because the data made the direction clear, and I'm not someone who delays filing when the data is clear. She was very still. I walked the east shoulder past the sinkhole cluster, he said. "I buy tea from a stall operator who needed 20 minutes to finish the cultivation history before I could purchase anything. I raise notation standardization issues at quarterly operations reviews using practical language because it actually works. I showed up on this planet 14 months ago and I have learned it methodically." He met her eyes. "I'd like to keep learning it, with you." A silence. The rain came sideways off the highland shelf, which he had learned to expect. "That's not technically a question," she said. "No," he said. "It's a statement of intention. The question is whether it matches yours." She set her cup down. She looked at him with the full, direct, unguarded amber warmth. No performance, no reserve, just Scythe, who mapped things carefully and named what she found and had told her mother, in a room with the weight of the entire Keen senior branch behind it, exactly what she intended to do. "It matches," she said. The formal response from the matriarch came 19 days later. It was a document in dual notation, Kaenthi primary form and colonial parallel, which was the first time Kael had ever seen a Keen family communication prepared in both formats. Scythe received it first and handed it to him without reading it, which he thought was either a very good sign or a very intentional form of trust. He read it. The matriarch had found no formal grounds for opposition. The document said this in language that was technically governance neutral and emotionally exact if you read the subtext correctly, which he did, because he'd spent 19 days learning how the matriarch structured information. What it said, under the careful formality, was, "I tested him thoroughly. He didn't break or perform or pretend. He filed for permanent residency before I asked him to, and my daughter knew about it and used it correctly. I would have objected to almost anyone. I find that I cannot object to him." There was a final line that was not governance language at all. It said, "The Vassal family's Highland cultivar is considered a courtesy gift when presented in a formal first meeting with the senior branch. You should know this before you arrive." Kael read this line twice. He looked up. Scythe was watching him. "She's inviting you," she said, "formally, to a senior branch meeting. The T is the protocol acknowledgement. You bring it, it confirms you know the form." "I know the form," he said. "I know you do. I told her." A pause. "I told her about the stall operator and the 20 minutes and the cultivation history." He looked at her, and Scythe's expression had the warmth in it that had been building for months, present and steady and precise, the way she delivered everything that mattered. She said anyone who lets old Vassal finish the history before purchasing is either genuinely courteous or performing courtesy very skillfully. And she concluded that someone who performs courtesy that consistently, in context with no audience, is simply courteous. Another pause. She said it was the point at which she stopped looking for the thing that was wrong with you. He thought about that, about the stall operator, about 20 minutes of cultivation history on a Tuesday morning when he'd simply wanted tea, and had recognized that the history was being offered as a context for the purchase, and refusing the context would be refusing the offer. "Old Vassal has very good tea," he said. "He does," she said. "I'd have listened to the history regardless." "I know," she said, and then with the precision she applied to everything she meant completely, "That's the point." The meeting with the senior branch was a formal affair, not ceremonial, but structured, with the particular weight of people who made real decisions and were accustomed to having those decisions stand. Kael arrived with the Highland tea. He was 10 minutes early, which he'd calculated as correct, early enough to demonstrate the meeting mattered, not so early as to create pressure on the household preparing the room. He stood in the Survey Bureau's formal entrance, in his field jacket with the seams sealed against the morning rain, and waited. A young Kaenthi attendant came down the stairs and escorted him up without ceremony, which he took as neutral. The matriarch was seated at the head of the meeting room's long survey table, The Keen family used survey maps as the visual reference even in governance contexts, which Scythe had told him, and which he found clarifying about the culture's priorities. The maps on the table today were the Veth Aron Eastern Ridgeline surveys, his and Scythe's joint documentation territory. He noted this too. 3 other senior branch members were present, including an older man who turned out to be Scythe's uncle Tavar Keen, and who assessed Kale with the particular sharp evaluation of someone who'd been skeptical before arriving and was revising in real time. Kale set the thermos on the side table that had been positioned for it. He recognized that this positioning was intentional. Someone had placed the table there for this purpose, which meant the tea was expected and the protocol was known. He acknowledged it without acknowledging it and sat where he was directed and answered questions for an hour with the same directness he'd used for the matriarch's 4-day assessment, because he had no other register, and it had worked, and more importantly, it was honest. Scythe sat to his left through the entire session, which he understood was deliberate. She was present as herself, neither advocating nor absent, simply there as the person whose choice had occasioned the meeting. The uncle, whose name was Tavar Keen, and who had been doing most of the revision in real time, asked near the end, "You understand what this means, formally, in Kaenthi terms?" "It means I'm entering a formal bond with Scythe and accepting the structural obligations to the Keen line that come with it," Kale said. "I've read the documentation." "It also means you become subject to Kaenthi residency law, which is independent of colonial classification." "I understand that. I have permanent station classification filed. Kaenthi residency law would supersede the colonial filing in most territorial matters." Tavar looked at him for a long moment. "Most human colonials find that clause concerning." "Most human colonials aren't planning to stay indefinitely and have already filed accordingly," Kale said. "The clause doesn't concern me. I've already indicated my intention structurally." Another long moment. Tavar looked at the matriarch. Some communication passed between them that was too fast and too quiet for Kale to read, though he caught the shape of it, something settling. The matriarch looked at him. "You know the Vassil cultivation history," she said. He had not expected this, coming at the end. "Yes," he said. "Approximately 6 generations of cultivation on the highland shelf, with a documented shift in soil amendment methods after the 3rd generation that changed the cultivar's flavor profile. The current stall is the 4th generation of the family operating it." A silence. "Old Vassil doesn't tell that to most people," she said. "I know, he told me himself." "Why did he tell you?" Kale thought about it. "Because I was paying attention when he was talking, and I think he could tell I actually wanted to know it rather than just waiting for him to stop so I could purchase the tea." The silence this time had a different quality. The matriarch stood. She said something in formal Kaenthi that was short and precisely delivered, and Scythe, who had been seated to Kale's left through the whole meeting, made a small sound beside him that he recognized, because he'd been building the frame for it for 14 months. It was the sound she made when something resolved in a way she'd hoped and not been entirely certain of. "She's accepted you formally," Scythe said quietly for him, "into the line." He nodded. He let it land without performing. Tavar, across the table, was looking at him with the expression of someone who had arrived skeptical and was now doing the particular internal accounting of a person who'd been proven wrong in a way they didn't mind being wrong. He said, "You're going to be extremely difficult to argue with." "I've been told I use practical language," Kale said. Something in Tavar's expression finally moved all the way to warmth. "Yes," he said, "my niece mentioned." The rain on Veth Aron came sideways. He knew that now, had known it for 14 months, had dressed for it every day, had walked the east shoulder past the sinkhole cluster on the access road, and bought tea from a stall operator who needed 20 minutes to establish the context before he'd sell you anything, and paid attention to all of it because that was how he learned things. Methodically, without announcing it, by showing up and staying. He was on the third terrace view of the Survey Bureau on an evening in late autumn, the highland shelf lit in the last copper light, the rain systems moving off the ridge in gray curtains the way they always did. Scythe was beside him. She had her satchel over one shoulder. She had not fully decided to stay, which meant she had already decided to stay, because she had been using this as her tell for months, and he knew it now the way he knew the angle the rain took off the highland shelf. The senior branch has already begun the integration documentation, she said. Tavar volunteered to coordinate it, which surprised my mother. It didn't surprise me, Kale said. She looked at him. No. He was revising from the moment I arrived. By the time I cited the soil amendment shift, he was already at the conclusion. He volunteered because he'd reached it himself and wanted to indicate that. Scythe looked at him for a long moment with the amber-warm directness. You read people, she said. I read systems, he said. People are a kind of system. My mother said the same thing, about how she works. He considered this. Then she and I have compatible methodology. Scythe was quiet for a moment. The light on the ridge was shifting, the gray curtains moving west. She said, she told me after the meeting that she didn't object when I warned her, in the working room. He thought about that, didn't object to what? To me telling her to leave you alone. A pause, her voice precise and measured. She said she had already reached the conclusion by that point. She was performing concern, to see how I would respond. He processed this. She was assessing you. Yes. Specifically, whether I had made up my mind clearly enough to state it directly in front of you, and in front of her at the same time. And you had. I had, she looked at the ridge. She said it was the confirmation she needed, not about you, about me. He thought about Scythe standing at the survey table with her notation stylus set down, facing her mother with the full weight of the keen senior branch implied in the room, and saying it clearly and without performance, leave him alone. I'm going to marry him. He thought about what it had cost and what it hadn't cost, and about the accuracy of his own data, which had been clear for longer than he'd filed it, but which he had filed eventually because the methodical thing and the honest thing were usually the same thing. Your mother is very good at her work, he said. Yes, Scythe said, I learned everything from her. He looked at her. She looked at him. The rain came off the highland shelf in a long gray curtain, moving west, and the last light caught the silver lilac of her skin and made it something between warm and luminous, and he thought, I have been learning this planet for 14 months and I am not finished yet, and I will not be finished for a long time, and that is exactly what I want. The permanent residency filing will clear in 6 to 8 weeks, he said. I know. And the Kaenthi documentation will. 3 months for full integration. Tavar is expediting it. All right. She looked at him. The small, precise expression, the warmest version of it, the one he'd been building the frame for since a rain-soaked road and a borrowed 2 seconds of stable footing, and a pair of amber-warm eyes that had looked at him with the total attention of someone who mapped things carefully and did not look away from what they found. You have more questions, she said. I always have more questions, he said. That's how I learn things. She was quiet for a moment, then ask them. He thought about the questions he had and ordered them by priority, which was the methodical approach, and the one that came first was also the simplest. Will you show me the survey notation system, he said. The full one, not the parallel documentation, the real one. She looked at him. It's 3 centuries old, she said. I know. It'll take a long time to learn properly. I know, he said. I'm not in a hurry. The rain came sideways off the highland shelf. She shifted her satchel. She had already decided to stay. Come inside, she said. I'll start with the substrate notation, That's where everything begins. He followed her in. She started with the substrate notation, as promised, spreading the reference maps across the working table and beginning from first principles. Not because she thought he was slow, but because she did not take shortcuts with foundations, and he had already demonstrated he would not ask her to. She explained the encoding logic, how the structural marks carried both spatial and compositional data simultaneously, how the system compressed what the colonial format needed 3 separate layers to represent. He asked questions. She answered them. The rain came on outside. That was how it started, and how it continued, and the notation system took him 2 years to learn properly, which he had expected. And he made her laugh, which he had not expected, on the day he filed his first Kaenthi primary survey addendum correctly, and she found a small error in the third terrace junction notation that he had made deliberately to see if she was checking. She was always checking. He had counted on that. The permanent classification cleared in 7 weeks. The Kaenthi integration documentation completed in just under 3 months, Tavar coordinating with the particular efficiency of someone who had decided to be useful, and was now being entirely useful. The matriarch attended the formal integration ceremony and stood at the head of the survey table, and said the words required by the Keen Lines lineage protocol. Her amber eyes settled and certain. And when it was done, she looked at Kale with the expression of someone who had arrived at a conclusion she was now satisfied with, which was the closest she came to warmth in formal contexts. Old Vasil, when Kale stopped at the stall the following morning, looked at him for a long moment and then said, without preamble, "I heard." "Yes," Kale said. "The Highland Shelf cultivar is appropriate for formal occasions in the Keen line. I'll set aside a reserve quantity." "That's appreciated." Old Vasil poured 2 cups without being asked, which was new. He slid one across the counter. "My grandmother married a colonial administrator," he said. "3rd generation. He learned the cultivation history." A pause, the brief efficient pause of someone who measures words like he measured tea leaves. He also let her finish telling it before he bought anything. Kale looked at the cup, then at the stall operator. "Good man, then," he said. "Yes," said old Vasil. "Most people worth knowing are."